This podcast and its related content are intended for listeners aged 18 and above. Some episodes may include sensitive topics such as trauma, abuse, or mental health struggles that could be emotionally triggering or distressing. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This podcast is created for educational and awareness purpose only and does not constitute legal, medical, or psychological advice. Welcome to Sunoh, the listening circle. The name Sunoh in Hindi means to listen, and more importantly, to be understood. This podcast aims to create a circle of understanding for South Asian women primarily, and anyone else who may be interested in these topics, from changing family structures to work-life balance, motherhood, singlehood, and much more. We are hoping to shake off stigma one conversation at a time. This season, we are looking at separation and divorce in the South Asian context. And I'm your host, Harveen. Hi, everyone. We're very fortunate today to be talking with Salma Khan, who has such a full life story and is also one of those reflective people who has not only been able to gain insights for herself about her path and decisions, but can also share them with others to integrate into their own understanding. I found a wonderful article by Salma when I was looking for resources online and reached out to her, and she has been generous with her time and wisdom. Salma was born in the UK to Pakistani parents and completed her early education in London before her family decided to move back to Pakistan when she was in her early teens. She lived in Islamabad till young adulthood, earning her undergrad degree in sciences before moving to the UK to do her master's from the prestigious London School of Economics. She has worked in the IT sector for almost 25 years, living in London and working with some of the top professional services in different sectors like broadcasting, retail, and now at a financial organization. Salma is also a mother, raising 2 children, and somehow also found time to train to be a divorce coach after her own experience with divorce. I personally found some of her experiences with the disconnect of success in public life while struggling in private life to be extremely relatable and powerful. I can't wait to get into all of these topics with you, Salma, today. Welcome to Sunoh.
Thank you very much, Harveen. That's a very kind introduction. Thank you.
So, Salma, tell us a little bit more about your background and your growing up years and how that shaped your values and your views on marriage, on family. What kind of family did you grow up in?
I grew up in quite I would say, a traditional Asian household. We are 4 sisters and 1 brother, and we were just a very, I should say, quite a happy, close family. My mother had a very difficult early marriage. When she got married, she did not have the opportunity to progress past primary school. That was a decision that her dad had made. But she was always very focused on her children getting an education. It was her primary passion throughout our younger years that even though she had not had the opportunity to go to high school, go to university, she wanted all of her children to do the best that they could. And I think that was the driving force. So we grew up in a household where dad went to work, and he was a great dad. I love my dad, but he wasn't around much. He was either working or he was out playing tennis. And then my mum was just always there at home. I suppose my greatest memory of my mum is like cooking. She loved cooking. She just used to say to us when we were younger is that you don't need to worry about the housework. You don't need to worry about cooking. I just want you guys to focus on your study. That's the kind of household we lived in. I think we had quite a privileged upbringing. In many ways, there was lots of love, there was lots of support. We always got what we wanted, I suppose, from a materialistic point of view. My dad did work incredibly hard. He was quite focused on making sure that his family were provided for. And my mum was also, I suppose, in many ways, quite a frugal individual in the sense that she wasn't one for spending lots of money on herself. She just wanted to make sure that the household was run properly. So in our early years, we were here in the UK. My parents had come here in their late teens, had an arranged marriage here when I was about 10. My dad had visited Pakistan. He went for a visit to Islamabad, came back and said to my mum, "Oh, I bought a house." We'd never been to Pakistan. Obviously, my mum and dad had, but as children, we had never been. And he said, "Yeah, I went to view this property and I just fell in love with it. And I thought, I'm just going to buy it." And a few years later, my parents walked in. I still remember it was about December and just said, "Oh, guys, we're all moving to Pakistan." There was no discussion. There was no like, maybe we might move. What do you guys think? It was just like, "Oh, we're moving." And we were just like, "Huh? Moving? What? What?" And so we moved. Literally within a month, we packed up and we were in Islamabad. And initially it was very tough. We didn't quite know the language that well. Obviously, we spoke a little bit of like Urdu or Punjabi due to interacting with our grandparents, but we never had to actually speak it on a regular basis. For the first year, there were lots of tantrums, there were lots of tears, there were lots of "I want to go home." We missed our cousins, we missed our family. But after the first year, when we settled into school, we went to a school for overseas Pakistanis. So we did end up meeting a lot of people that had quite similar circumstances to ours, had lived a large part of their life up until that point abroad. And then their families had come back for various different reasons. So we were able to meet people that we could connect with, had quite similar backgrounds to ours. And then we were there for about 10 years. And I have to say, I absolutely loved it. I miss it hugely. I initially came back to the UK just to do my master's with all intentions of going back. However, life didn't quite pan out that way. I did my master's and I got an offer for a job from one of the big five. So I thought, okay, it doesn't matter. Maybe I'll just work for them for a couple of years and then I'll go back. And then I met my ex-husband. And then I thought, maybe like after we've lived here for a couple of years, I'll go back. That never happened. And now 30 years later, I'm still here in London.
That's such an incredible journey that you've had, Salma, and also your family. Your grandparents were also earlier in the UK with you?
Yeah.
Okay.
All my mum and dad's when I say entire family, I meant their siblings and their parents were here in London.
And how old was your mom when she got married? Because you said that at the time she didn't finish her education. So what age might that be?
She was about 19 when she got married. Her dad decided that she would not go to school after she finished her final year at primary school. So I think it's about year 6, what we would call it. And then he decided that women didn't need to study further than year 6 because they needed to be at home and learn like women wifey things, I'm assuming.
And then so amazing that your mom got that intergenerational change going for you, that you shouldn't focus on housework, but mainly focus on your education. Because I really think that mothers of that generation had that feeling. And my mom said the same thing to me, Salma. She really emphasized that I should just focus on my studies. I mean, now I feel that, okay, in hindsight, I should have learned maybe a couple of things, especially vis-a-vis cooking. I'm a better cook now. But in my growing up years too, that was just a complete no-no. She wouldn't let me do anything at home. So I love it that your mom was of a similar mindset and made all these things possible for you in many ways.
I think it was also largely influenced, I think, by the early years of her marriage. When she first came to this country, her and my grandmother would work in factories and she had 5 brothers. And the focus was on the 5 brothers to get an education. So her and her mom worked in order to run the household so that brothers could get an education and have careers. But when my mom got married, she was living in a joint family system and her in-laws were incredibly, incredibly abusive at that time. And one of the hardest things that both my mom and dad found, because my dad was from a family where he could see that the treatment was wrong, but he wasn't brave enough to stop it. And so the abuse would happen and he would apologize to my mum later, but not have the ability to actually challenge his mum. His mum was very much the head of the family. And whatever she decided would happen, whether it was right or wrong and so I think my mum found in the very early years of her marriage, even if she had wanted to leave the marriage, she couldn't because she had no way of financially supporting herself. She wouldn't have had anywhere to go because she didn't have her own property. She was very much dependent on my dad and his family. And then, as fate would have it, they ended up with 3 daughters initially. We're quite close in age, the 3 of us. And I think that changed my parents' ideas a lot, because I think from my mom's perspective, she was like, I don't want my daughters to ever go through what I'm going through. And I think equally, my dad was, I don't want my daughters to ever be in that position. Because I think it's one thing when you see it happening elsewhere. I think it's another thing when you think, okay, this is the world that my daughters are going to go out into. And would I want anyone to treat my daughters like that? Absolutely not. So I think a lot of the push for education and the push for financial independence was largely due to their experiences and trying to get us into a situation where, yes, you might end up in a bad relationship or a bad marriage. Of course, you can't anticipate that. But at least my dad always used to say to us that, if you are financially independent, you will always have the option to walk away. And I think that was really the drive.
And that's also very progressive, Salma, at that time for both your parents to focus on the financial independence and to really explicitly articulate that you could walk out. I think that's amazing to hear, because even as of today, we hear of parents not supporting the decisions of their children, making it much harder in the South Asian community. When you yourself as a teenager were moving from the UK back to Pakistan, how was your personal experience? Was there an element of cultural shock or the way of living, or was it still similar enough because of your exposure to the expat Pakistani community in the UK that you were already quite okay with the lifestyle that you were exposed to in Pakistan? How was that for you?
There was a culture shock, but not necessarily in the way that people would expect. Yes, we were living in Islamabad. Our exposure to, I suppose, the real Pakistan was quite limited. We lived and socialized with a very small sort of minority of people. We all spoke English. We all had traveled abroad. But I think for us, the biggest change was the level of freedom that we had in Pakistan, which you'd think it'd be the opposite. For years later, this always baffled me, because the life we were living in Pakistan was very different to the life that I saw my cousins living here in the UK as they were growing up. And the only way that I can explain it, and I hope this makes sense to your audience, is when our parents left, be it India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, wherever they came from, when they left in the 60s or 70s, they left a very different world. And then they came to the West, and there were parts of them that they wanted to hold on to really, really tightly, like the traditions and the cultures. And they didn't want to be the ones that would be completely letting go of everything that they knew. So they held on to these cultures and traditions from the 60s, the 70s, maybe the 80s, whenever they came here. And also a lot of them came from the villages, where life is very different. Segregation and the way women are treated and the men, and all of these things, the culture and traditions are very different in the villages. They held on to these kind of restrictions about how women should behave and how men should behave. They come from a very different world, which doesn't always translate when you're living in the UK. However, parents hold on to them really tightly because they don't want to lose their link to India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. But when we went to Pakistan, we realized that people weren't living in the 60s and the 70s. They had moved forward to, the 2000s, 2010. And so life has evolved there. The cultures have evolved. The traditions have evolved. And so we were living in a city where we felt that we had a lot more freedom to interact with people, to go out, to go to parties, etc., which our parents were always very wary of when we were in the UK. Because that's a Western thing, right? You wouldn't want your daughters going to a party late at night, but it's quite normal, right? We would have parties at university, we would have Valentine's Day, we would make the most of university life. And so for us, it was actually much more liberating. to be living in a country where you could actually just be yourself. There were no like, you can't do this because then you might be too westernized. We were just living at home and just living our lives. So in many ways, I found it very liberating. In fact, I find life here for a lot of young people much more restrictive here in the UK than it is for young people living in Pakistan.
We've had another guest who's also mentioned something similar. Also, I remember that some of my cousins who were living in different countries because their parents had moved quite early to these countries. And we would have a little bit of a reverse culture shock because I spent most of my growing up years in India. And we were like poles apart. We were moving on in a very different lifestyle. But a lot of the old ways, even in language and terms being used, remained intact in those groups. And I'm just wondering, because I think in some communities, when they're also moving, in my experience, they tend to also not just cling more to the cultural roots, but also religious roots. Do you think that that was also true in your community? Would you say that?
I do see that around me. Absolutely. I do see that around me. I think my growing up, my mother has always been quite religious, very self-taught. Like I said, she hadn't progressed in school, but she was also very intent upon learning. And my dad was the other extreme. He wasn't religious at all. He believes in God, but he wasn't outwardly religious. The great thing for us was that my mum, I remember she was always reading books, translations, opinions, etc. So she didn't really enforce any sort of religious ideas on us that she hadn't researched herself. She would always encourage us that you should pray, do this, do that, but it was never forced on us. Within our family of 5, there are varying degrees, even at this moment in time, of how much we have embraced our religion.
That sounds wonderful, Salma, to hear that you were brought up in a family where your parents were very open minded about these subjects. And you also said that you had a lot of freedom in the growing up years in Pakistan. But when it comes to generally roles of women, do you remember seeing that also similar to your experience in the larger context of the city that you were growing up in? Or was that just unique to your family and your upbringing?
I think, at least in Islamabad, it was quite the norm for women to be more progressive, to women to be working, having careers, even if they weren't working, and they might be involved in sort of social enterprises, in charity work, at least within the circles that we were moving in. Women had a role. Women had passions. They had things that they wanted to do. And I think that's great. I feel that this idea that women should be staying at home and looking after just the home and there's no space for anything else is something that I've seen more in the West than I actually saw in Pakistan.
Coming to your family setup, when it comes to the dynamics that you were also seeing between your parents and your grandparents and the kind of equation your mom had with your grandparents, what was your impression of it? What were you taking from that experience?
I think on my mum's side, my mum and my nani were very strong characters. They were grafters. They would set their sights on what they want to do and they would get it done. I think they both had a massive influence on me and my sisters. My grandmother arrived in the UK in the 60s, and within 4 weeks of being here, her husband died of a heart attack. So she found herself in the UK alone, not knowing what to do. And so she actually was a completely self-made woman. She got a job with the help of the community, because obviously the communities helped her out. She slowly ended up calling all of her children one by one, as and when she could afford to, until she got her family together. And during that time, she worked, she bought herself a house, she educated her children. She was just a force of nature. I mean, she did not give up. She didn't just decide that she was just going to go back to Pakistan. And she knew that if she went back to Pakistan, she would be incredibly dependent on handouts from the extended family. She didn't want that. And I think that fight was what transferred across to my mum. So I think they have been a massive influence on me and my sisters. My grandmother passed away about 10 years ago. And I always used to say that if I could be half as strong, or even a quarter of how emotionally and resilient she was, I'd be okay in life.
Love it that your grandmother was a strong figure.
Yeah.
And maybe we come back to, your growing up years and your education. You went back to the UK to study. What were your thoughts on marriage at that point, and even your family expectations around the topic of marriage?
Yeah, this is where life gets complicated. So yes, there was definitely there's always this pressure to get married in the Asian community. It's just always there. Even if it's not said out loud, it's there. And I have to be honest, I didn't ever really want to get married. I just wanted to be free and study and travel the world. And I've always kind of felt like marriage wasn't for me. However, you also have this entrenched sort of responsibility to your parents. So my parents would always say to us, well, if you want, you don't have to have an arranged marriage, right? If you meet somebody, then just tell us. What that really was, what they were saying is just hurry up and get married, please. Like, you've done your master's now, you've got a job. And so I suppose that pressure is sort of on for most Asian women, right? No matter how progressive your parents may claim to be. So then eventually I did meet somebody, and I suppose there was a part of me that thought, okay, well, this is the natural next step, right? I should just get married. If I'm perfectly honest, I don't know if I did it for myself. I actually did it because I knew that's what my parents wanted. I mean, I'm not saying that I didn't like love him at the time. Of course I did. So I thought, right, okay, let's just get married. And my parents were over the moon. They were so happy. It was a big wedding. It was the first wedding in our family. Very soon afterwards, I realized that this was going to be really hard for someone like me, because suddenly there was these expectations to conform to a certain lifestyle. And it was, I suppose, very different to how my life had been when I was at home living with my parents. There was a certain sense of freedom to think, freedom to argue, freedom to sort of express my opinions. And we were the kind of family that we still are. Like, we have very differing views sometimes. And, we'll argue about it and we'll debate it. But we were never stopped from having an opinion. So suddenly after I got married, I realized quite soon into the marriage that actually my opinions were not allowed. Like, if I didn't completely agree with what my ex-husband was thinking or planning, it would cause conflict. And I found that very difficult, because I'm not even suggesting for 1 minute that I always like to have my own way. We didn't grow up in that kind of household. But I really needed to be heard. However, this is where you realize that how influenced you are by your community. Because in the back of my head, what was always sort of going on was, but I have to make this work. This is my job to make this work. I'm the one who has to, okay, well, if he doesn't like me having an opinion, then I'll just stop having an opinion to stop the conflict. If he doesn't like me going here, then I think I just shouldn't go. And all of these things. And I realized that were so ingrained, these belief systems. It wasn't like when we were growing up, my mum had ever said, well, you have to do this and you have to do that. But I had always seen my mum accommodate my dad in some ways. Like, my dad always, and still does, do what he wants to do. And my mum would be the one that would be accommodating, would put up with it, sort of just smooth everything over. And now I think back and I think that's probably why we had such a happy household. And I think you don't realize how much of that you're absorbing, even though nobody's actually said to you that that is your role. So I was doing all of this sort of smoothing over, stepping back, trying to make myself really small because it would just make life easier. But at the same time, internally, there was this massive conflict because I could not understand why I was feeling so undermined all the time, or I was feeling so resentful. And at the time, like on the surface, I was working for one of the big 5 companies. I was running a project where we were rolling out a system across 15 different global locations. I had a lot of responsibility at work. I was running teams of like 15 plus people and I was doing it well. And when then I'd get home and I'd close the front door and I'd become like a mouse almost, tiptoeing and sort of trying to do better, trying to cook better, trying to clean better, trying to make sure that I didn't upset my ex-husband. And I could not work out why these two sides of me were so different, why there was such a conflict there. And I wanted to be a good wife. I absolutely did. I wanted my marriage to work. I wanted to be a good mum. But the more I did and the more I let go of myself, the less I was achieving. Like nothing was ever going to be enough. And I think from my mum's history, where she often said as we were growing up that she had stuck in the marriage because she didn't know what she would have done with 3 daughters if she'd left my dad in those early years. In my head, I was desperate to leave because I was so unhappy. But I was thinking, if I tell my mum's going to say to me, you just have to stay for the kids. There's no other way. And so I stuck with it. I just became a shell of who I was. I was living a double life. I was one person at home and I was one person when I left the house and I went to work and did the corporate stuff and I came home. And it was having a huge impact on my health. When you're talking about such high levels of constant stress, it's going to have an impact not only on your physical health, but also on your mental health. There's only so much that you can pretend to the world that everything is okay. People can see through that facade at some point. And so I started thinking about divorce. I knew I had to, not only for myself, but for the sake of my children. They were growing up in an extremely toxic household. And my children actually were growing up in a household where they were shouting all the time. There was shouting, there was throwing things, there was just a huge lack of respect for me, even for the feelings of my children sometimes. So I knew I had to leave. I just didn't have the strength to leave, even though financially it would have been fine. I had my parents nearby, I had my sisters, but I was scared of what my mum was going to say. I just thought the minute I tell my mum I want to divorce, she's going to be devastated. She's going to convince me to stay. She's going to tell me that children can't grow up without a dad. And so on the day that I finally did just say, right, that's it, I'm filing for divorce, I can't do this anymore. And it seems so bizarre now when I think back to, almost 10 years ago. I knew that my dad would support me. I really, really desperately wanted my mum's support. And I remember not being brave enough to go to her house. So I rang her and I said to her, Mum, I'm going to file for divorce. And I'll never forget what she said to me. She said to me, do you know what, Bitta? You do not know how long I've been waiting for you to say those words. She said, I've seen how destructive this marriage has been for you. And she goes, but you still got on with it. So I didn't want to interfere. I didn't want to come to you and say, leave him. He's destroying you. And I just think those words from her, to know that she was on my side and that she approved and she was going to be there, it was just a game changer. Because from then onwards, life didn't seem scary anymore. I just thought, well, fine. If my mum can support me, because she was probably one of the strongest figures in my world, then I'm going to be okay. And I think that is a push that I needed. And that's why I feel so upset and heartbroken when I have clients that come to me whose parents won't stand by them at a time like this, because I don't think those parents sometimes can realize how much their child needs them to hold them up at that point in time. Yeah, because it's such a massive decision. The world is going to be so judgmental once you've made that decision to walk away from a marriage. Because, often when you have these toxic individuals, the persona that they're showing the world is very different to the persona that you are coming into contact with day in, day out. So you have to have that support of somebody that's going to hold you up and say, fine, I'm with you. I find that, when parents are not able to do that because they're more worried about what auntie next door is going to say or uncle down the road is going to say or how it's going to impact the image of their family from a cultural perspective, I just find that really heartbreaking.
Salma, you've shared your story so vividly, and I think there is so much that I resonate with it. One, but also just hearing that, you were so outspoken and you had your opinions and you needed to be heard, and how slowly erosion of voice and identity that happened in your marriage, where you were seeing that duality in your life. I can't even imagine how difficult it must have been. And then all the time waiting for validation from your parents. And I'm glad that they stood by you with this decision. But at the same time, had you not taken care of yourself at that point to understand that this is only me who can now take care of me with all that you were struggling with, that change would have not happened in your life.
No.
And same for your kids.
Yeah. And it was incredibly scary because you really don't know when you take that step, you really don't know how hard it's going to be. Mentally, it really broke me, even though it's exactly what I wanted to do. I spent a lot of time in the immediate years in therapy. There were lots of tears. There was lots of loss of self-confidence. I just spent a few years just feeling incredibly sorry for myself. And it was through the therapies, then further down the line, there was some coaching, because I just felt like for about 5 years after my divorce, I just had no goals in life. And up until my marriage, I was very goal orientated. I was like, well, in 5 years' time, I want to be here. And then I want to be able to buy this house. And I want to be able to pay off my car, or whatever the goals were. And then I think with all of the mental load of the breakdown of my divorce and then trying to work out who I was. And I think the hardest part was that I was very angry at myself for many, many years. I was very angry at myself for allowing somebody to treat me that way. And so there was a lot of sort of self-inflicted criticism. There was why would you allow someone to treat you like that? You've got an education, you've got a job, you had your family support behind you. Why did you allow somebody? And I think once you start delving into those questions, you start answering them. Because I think a lot of the times when we're self-reflecting, we ask these questions, but we never answer them. We just berate ourselves. But what I say to my clients always is, okay, let's answer that question. Why did you do it? And then when you start looking beyond that and you start peeling the layers, it was because on some level, I really loved this man and I wanted things to work. So I tried lots of different things to try and make it work. And then one day you just kind of wake up and then suddenly you realize, I've actually got nothing else to try and do now. I'm out of options. I absolutely think that, when any relationship that's breaking down, whether it's a marriage or a relationship with a parent or a sibling, relationships are complicated. We're two different personalities and there's always going to be things that you don't like about each other. But you have to try everything that you possibly can before you decide that actually this is destroying me.
That is so true, Sama, because you had given everything possible in this. And again, it's very relatable because hearing you speak, it's almost like as if it's my own inner dialogue being spoken to me by another person, you know. But when you said that you were angry at yourself for allowing that, I think sometimes people have said that to me, and it is very triggering actually for me. Before I came to the point of now asking that question to myself, that why did I allow myself this? Were there also other aspects that you've realized about your personality, about who you are as an individual, to come to some answers? Because I'm still struggling, but there are few parts of me that are going back to some teenage years. They're going back to other relationships I had. How do I deal with my friends on a human level? Where I'm realizing that there were certain other elements of my own well-being and psychology which led me to keep trying it even when the rope was stretched way too much. I had tried enough.
I was always a people pleaser. I get my validation the same way I needed my mum to validate my feelings. I have realized through my journey that I've been on in the last 10, 12 years that my happiness comes from making other people happy. I've tried and I worked on that, and I think I've made huge improvements in that. But I think a lot of it is from when you're a child, being the eldest of 5 siblings, being my mum's support. My mum relied on me quite a lot. I think as we were growing up, now when I look back, I was very much a parentified child. Even now, my mum and dad, now that we're all grown up and, my siblings are all grown up, even now when something needed to be done or they needed to have a conversation with somebody like one of my siblings, or they wanted them to push them to do something, my parents never went to them direct. They would come here. So there was this sense of always doing stuff for others and trying to fix things for everybody else. And I think in my marriage, that's what I was doing. I knew that this person was very broken. He'd had a very toxic, here's me making excuses for him again, you see. He'd had a very toxic childhood. He'd grown up in a very abusive childhood. So there was a lot of learned behavior there that came out in our marriage, because often children will emulate what they've seen growing up. And I was trying to fix him. I was thinking, well, if I'm kind enough and I'm loving enough and I'm understanding enough, however, you can't fix somebody else. They have to be able to take responsibility for their behaviors. I'm not saying that people don't grow up in really awful households. They absolutely do. But once we are adults or young adults, we can take responsibility for working through our own traumas. And we have to take responsibility. Otherwise, we carry that into our relationships, into our lives. And that's one of the things that I've had to work really hard with my own children. Not so much my daughter, because she was 4 when I finally made that decision to leave, but my son was 9. And so he did witness quite a lot of shouting, quite a lot of toxic behavior. And he almost like between 7 and 9 became like my protector. And I didn't want that. I wanted my children to just be children. And so when he got to about his teens, he became very angry. He'd lash out at me. He'd lash out at his sister. And a lot of it, when he would behave like that, it would take me straight back to how his dad behaved. And we started clashing quite a lot. And then through therapy for myself, I had to start changing, firstly, my view. Because what was happening is when he was having a lash out, it was taking me straight back to my ex-husband. So I was no longer fighting with my son, who was a 14-year-old child that was still learning how to control his emotions. Straight away, I was fighting with my ex-husband. And there's a completely different dynamic there. So not only was I treating him like an adult, but I was not respecting the fact that he is actually a separate individual. Of course, he has not learned how to manage his emotions right now. Of course, he's going through all of these teenage things that, teenagers do. And he's trying to find his place in the world. But my behavior, by constantly being triggered and seeing, oh my God, he's just becoming his dad, was not helpful. So I've had to do a lot of work, especially with him, to kind of point out that actually that's unacceptable. I'm not having that in this house. You do not treat your sister like that. And I think very often, especially in our communities I've seen, is that we are unable to point out abusive behavior. We see our brothers doing it. We see our dads doing it. We may even see our sons doing it. But we don't point it out and say, hang on a minute, you can't speak to your wife like that, or you can't speak to your sister like that. We have to get better at pointing out unacceptable behaviors. It's not okay for your brother to abuse his wife and you not say anything. That's not okay. Because if your brother doesn't know how to behave, he can learn how to behave. And how do people learn? When someone points out a behavior and says, that's really unacceptable. Please don't speak to her like that. And similarly with my dad, there's often times, bless her, my mum's not here anymore, but as we were growing up, there were often times where my dad would say something really quite mean to my mum. And my mum was always the passive, okay, it doesn't matter. This is how marriages are supposed to be, right? And I think it's only when us four got into our teens and we would say, Dad, don't speak to mum like that. That's not fair. Why have you made her cry? Go and say sorry. And then slowly, thankfully, my dad is the kind of person you can pull him up on bad behavior. And I think slowly that also changed him as a human being, because in his household, that was normal for men. They don't even consider it abusive. Often in the Asian communities, there are so many behaviors which we don't even recognize as being abusive.
Absolutely. And Salma, like how you got triggered by now your son's actions, that's also completely natural because of what life situation you were coming from. But to call out that behavior and hoping for a better future for him and you and the dynamics, I think that's exactly where action on all of us lies. That how are we all engaging as a community, calling certain behaviors out because there are some root causes. There were situations that quite likely led to it, but the fact that how do we heal from this slowly and progressively, it's almost like with every podcast interview, I get more insights that are maybe going to be a part of my own healing. It's like this entire podcast has become my personal therapy. So, one of the things we're trying to also do with this podcast is to share with our listeners that where is it that you knew there was something off? There were some red flags, but somehow you ignored it, you missed it. And are there lessons now in hindsight that we can share with people?
I think we choose to ignore those red flags. I think we are very good at making excuses for people's behavior because we care about them and we live in hope that next time it will be different. I think that's perfectly normal from, human psychology perspective. We don't want to give up on people. But I think what we do as individuals is we ignore the feelings that we're having inside. For me, one thing that I've started nurturing within myself is not to ignore when something feels uncomfortable. I used to get like a churning in my stomach that felt like I had like a rock in my stomach that was just always there, turning and turning. And what I've realized now that I'm a bit more aware of myself is that actually whenever you meet somebody, your mind and your body is connected. So you do get these feelings. You do get this, you can call it sixth sense. People often call it hindsight. So I kind of knew that, but I didn't really act on it. It's actually your body telling you that something is not right here. But what we tend to do is we kind of bury it aside and say, I'm just looking too much into this. Oh, he was just tired today. Or he just had a rough day at work. It's that project that is pressurizing him. We make these excuses ourselves, even if the other person hasn't suggested that they're overly stressed or pressured by work. And even if they are, we need to find ways to relieve that stress. Stress is not an excuse for treating somebody else badly. We need to start being much more aware of relationships that have probably been in our lives for a very long time, but are they contributing anything to our well-being? If they're not, then we need to start stepping back from those relationships. I'm not saying we cut people out. That's not always possible because sometimes these people are maybe our immediate family, but you can stop prioritizing spending time with them without cutting yourself off. So I think really listening to the voice in here is really important. I believe that whoever you believe in, whether it's God or a higher being or the universe, call it what you like, is always talking to you. We just don't listen because we want that relationship, right? We want that job. So we block everything else out. That is all the flags that are saying that's not good for you. And I suppose that's part of the joys of being in love. Like we do lose the ability to be objective. But I think it's really important in those early years when you're not so involved to be able to stay a little bit objective and rational, to think, okay, I don't like that behavior. It didn't make me feel good. Does that person have the ability to change it, to work on it? If they don't, then that's your answer.
That's a bundle of tips there, Salma. I'll have to re-listen to this entire thing for myself. One thing I think really stood out, which you said that stress is also not an excuse for bad behavior, and knowing that and recognizing those reactions to cut the cord there. And coming to when you actually made the decision to get divorced, during that time, how did the entire divorce process come about?
So the day that I finally said to my husband that I'm filing for divorce, he'd been sleeping on the sofa for about 2 years. We didn't have a functioning relationship at that point. We were living in the same house with the two children and essentially living separate lives. And I suppose it makes me smile now because when I filed for divorce, it still came as quite a shock to him. Like, he literally turned around to me and said, "Do you know what you're saying?" And I remember saying, "I think this is the first time in years that I actually do know what I'm saying." And I think it's a very Asian mindset that marriage is for life. So as far as he was concerned, it didn't matter that we were not living a married life, but in his head, marriage was for life. So that was one thing that shocked me because I was thinking, I don't understand. And I do believe that if I had continued and not filed for divorce, like 10 years later, we'd probably still be living in the same way. Because as far as he was concerned, we were married and we were just going to be married forever. And I was just thinking, I can't live like this. I really can't live like this. I'm just so incredibly unhappy. I'm so mentally depleted that I'm not here anymore. He wanted to reconcile because for him, the cultural reality of him going back to his family and saying, my wife doesn't want to be married to me anymore, was too huge then to actually accept that, well, we're just going to file for divorce. There didn't have to be any animosity, really, because I was always of the opinion that the children should have contact with their dad. I didn't want to stop any contact with the children. I was like, you can see them whenever you want to see them, but they are going to stay with me. But yes, the divorce process itself was incredibly, incredibly stressful. He just did not want to agree to anything. You know, initially, I thought that the divorce process was going to be quite straightforward because we literally had a house to divide. In the end, it just became so stressful that I did have to hand it over to a solicitor to do it because we just could not get any progress out of him. In terms of the religious divorce, because here in the UK, we had been registered, so that was actually with the courts. We ended up spending 30,000, 40,000 pounds each to fight this divorce, which was completely unnecessary, but there was no way that I could get him to agree anything. In terms of the khula, so within the Muslim faith, you know, if the husband divorces you, it's called a talaq, but if the woman divorces the man, it's called a khula. And there's a misconception within the Muslim community that if the man refuses to sign the khula papers, that it's not going to happen. That's a complete misconception. It absolutely is going to happen. You just have to go through the proper channels. And so he ignored every one of the khula notifications. He got 3 in the, I suppose, the belief that he wasn't going to set me free. He was going to hold on to this marriage in whichever way he could. And so he did not sign or respond to any of the notices that came. So yeah, at every step of the way, he made it so difficult. And I could never quite understand why, because we weren't happy. You know, we were destroying each other. Now, I'm not going to for 1 minute sit here and say that I wasn't to blame as much as he was. Maybe if I'd been stronger, maybe if I'd had better boundaries, maybe if I'd been able to stand up for myself, we wouldn't have got to the place that we did, which was ended up in being such a destructive relationship. But I can't think of one reason why either of us would have wanted to hold on to that marriage. But yeah, it was quite long drawn. It took about 18 months. And for many years afterwards, and I think this is quite an important point for lots of people, when you're in an abusive relationship, even when you've left the marriage, that abuse can continue unless you put some really strong boundaries in, which is really difficult because during that period, you are so emotionally distraught that sometimes it's difficult. Just being divorced doesn't actually mean that you've left the relationship. Often the abuse continues for many years after 2 parties have divorced, whether that is through using the children as a weapon against either parent, and it could be the husband or the wife doing this. So I had to learn to set my boundaries. I had to learn to sort of be braver, be stronger, and say no. And while the children were younger, I had to have some level of contact with him. because the children weren't capable of organizing their own plans. Now, when my eldest turned about 16, that was my opportunity to say, well, actually, I don't need to be in the middle of this relationship anymore. I need to look after myself. So in the last 2 or 3 years, I actually have no contact now, because for my own mental health, I feel that is the only thing that works for me. I think after all these years, it doesn't matter whose fault it is. Once a relationship is over, once you've gone your separate ways, actually, it doesn't matter if you're going to put a label on it whose fault it was, because it's finished. Some couples can go their separate ways and keep some sort of relationship that's friendly. Others can't. They're both okay.
Very nuanced reflections from you here, Salma, because I think there's a lot of richness in how much time and distance has given you a lot of perspective. I can really hear that. I think I do want to say one thing. Like at some point, you were saying that if you had been more strong and had you drawn those boundaries, I think in so many ways, you were eventually strong. You are the one who stepped up for yourself. I have to sometimes remind myself and many others of this, that the day you decided to walk out, you already were strong and you took that decision for yourself. And also, this is something with people who've had toxic marriages or relationships. This part of how your husband was still trying to stay in it, to have that power dynamic, making things much more difficult. Again, a very repeated cycle that we hear where people have had narcissistic or other people, that the kind of toxic marriages or abusive marriages they've had. I do want to talk a little bit more about how you were then grappling to come out of this for yourself. How was that journey for you?
I was in therapy with the same therapist for probably about 5 years. I can hand on heart say she probably saved my life at that time. I mean, she was amazing. But the one thing that would always, I suppose, bother me sometimes, where I would be sitting in these sessions and I would be talking about something to do with my family dynamics or this whole aspect of why, because I filed for the British divorce, but I didn't file for the Muslim divorce till much later. And I couldn't work out why that was such a big step for me, because I didn't consider myself to be hugely religious. And I was thinking, why can't I just do it? But there was just something within me that meant so much more. So I would spend almost a quarter or half of the session sometimes explaining to my therapist what these terms meant, why these religious, cultural things were so important to me. And I'd leave the session and I'd be thinking, God, I've just spent all this money because, a therapy session isn't cheap. And I've just spent half the time explaining concepts and cultural traditions to my therapist. And I remember thinking, wouldn't it have been lovely if I was just having this conversation with somebody that just understood the Asian dynamics of needing your parents to support you through something? I suppose there are just certain norms of being brought up in an Asian family that lots of Western minds can't understand, right? Like, why don't you just tell your parents how it is? Well, it doesn't quite work like that. That's where the idea first came. But obviously, I was trying to rebuild my career. Financially, I was independent, but it was tough. Suddenly paying a mortgage, bringing up 2 children on one salary was not easy. So this whole idea of changing careers would always scare me, because I was like, well, I'm the only earner in this house. I can't just risk giving up my job and pursuing this dream of wanting to be a coach or a therapist, because what if it doesn't work out, and how am I going to pay the bills? So all of this was going around in my head for a very long time. And during that time, I moved jobs, and then COVID hit. And within about 2 or 3 months of COVID hitting, I lost my job. And I remember waking up for the first time in maybe 25 years since I'd graduated and thinking, what do I do? Like, what am I going to do today? It was the most surreal moment, because I think I had always worked. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I don't know when I'm going to get another job, but I had to do something with my time. So I signed up to a coaching. The lady that I had done some coaching with was now running her own coach training program. So I gave her a call and I said, look, I'm thinking about doing this. And she said to me, do you know what? When I was coaching you, I always thought you'd be a good coach. So why don't you give it a try? I thought to myself, well, if I don't do it now, when the market opens up again, I'm going to end up getting a job and life is just going to continue. And I'm going to be kicking myself thinking, this is the first time in my life that I've had the time to pursue something other than working for a corporate. So I did the coach training and then I knew that I wanted to niche into divorce coaching. So then I just happened to bump into somebody on Instagram who had just started a divorce coaching academy. So by the end of that year, so 6 months for the coach training and then a 6 months for the divorce coaching academy. And then I just kind of thought, right, I might as well try this. I think I was quite clear from the beginning that I wanted to do divorce coaching within the South Asian community because that's where I feel that I can make the biggest difference. Not only by understanding how people feel stuck, why they can't move forward, even without them having to explain to me, even though I had quite a supportive family. I've seen examples of families where they're not so supportive. I've heard the things people say when they want their daughters to stay in abusive relationships. But also what I really want to do through my coaching is to be there for those women that don't have anybody to hold them up. Not having your parents' support or not having your family nearby should not be a barrier to removing yourself from an abusive marriage. Here in the UK, I suppose the added layer that we have is sometimes women don't have any immediate family here in the country. The only family they have around them are their in-laws. So when that's not working out, they're pretty much isolated. And so the way that I feel the work that I want to do is to be the backbone for these people so that they're not alone, so that they can make the right decisions for themselves. The thing that I like to encourage people to do is even if you don't currently have any qualifications, right? You don't know what you want to do with your life. Start somewhere. Get yourself onto a training course. Do something so that when you do eventually decide to leave, you're still on the route to somewhere. Because if you don't start today, in 5 years' time, you're still going to be stuck in that same awful situation, but you're still not going to have anything to leave with. So even if you're not in a position to leave today, start laying the stepping stone to make yourself stronger, to find some financial independence, to find the mental strength to move forward. So it's not always just about, I need to leave today, because that's not always possible, right? We can't make these rash decisions to just get up and leave, especially when there's children involved. Children need somewhere to live. Children need food to eat, as do we. But what we can start doing is to think about, this is where I'm at. If this doesn't get any better, what do I need to do to get from A to B? Or do I need to get a better job? And I think sometimes you have to work backwards. Because when I was vying for my property, I wanted to stay in the house. I would have to buy him out. So I went to a mortgage advisor and I said, look, how much will I have to be earning in order for me to keep this property? So I needed to pay him off. So I would need to remortgage on my own. And so I said to him, can you tell me what salary I need for me to be able to get that mortgage? And he gave me a figure and I was earning a little bit below that, significantly below that. So then I thought, right, I have no other option besides to start looking for another job. And that's what I did.
Mhm.
Because unless you don't know what you're aiming for, you're never going to get there. So you have to start setting yourself goals and getting yourself the information. You know, when people say, I'm thinking about divorce, but I don't know what the settlement would be. And I always say to them, I don't know what your settlement's going to be either. But what I would advise you to do is go and speak to a solicitor, just have a one-off consultation, right? Take the facts. This is what we earn. This is the house that we have. This is how old our children are, blah, 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 blah. These are the investments we've got, whatever it is. Go and speak to a solicitor, because what they will be able to do is to give you an idea. People often catastrophize like, well, if I leave him, I'm going to be homeless. If I do this, this is going to happen. None of these are true. Courts are there to try and create some sort of fair settlement for both parties. So if you go and speak to a solicitor, even if you're not ready to file for divorce, it gives you something to work with. So often our fears are fueled by lack of information.
Mm-hmm. True. So true. The fact that there was a personal experience you were going through with your therapy and how you did see a void, because that part about being understood, I think that is so important vis-a-vis sensitive topics, especially in our culture. And the way a person who has been through a similar experience understands you, I think that is also the entire reason of why I even thought that I should do this podcast. I mean, I have a great therapist. I work with her now for a couple of years, but I do know that some of the cultural context, I really had to see some black and white Western perspective on it. And I'm not saying that that's completely wrong, but that was not my focus, because then the person is focusing on what they are observing in my life and my culture, and there are sometimes some judgments, some stereotypes attached, but that's not my problem. My problem is something else, and that takes only a cultural context experience to be really understood.
And I think just because something has always been way doesn't mean it can't change or evolve. Well, because the world has evolved. People have evolved. Women have more education now. Women have more independence. So if we as individuals are evolving, then it only makes sense that certain cultural traditions will also have to evolve with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not going to work. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves where, on one hand, we now have an education. We are being encouraged to think differently, think outside of the box. But then at the same time, we're being restricted by the cultural norms. And cultural norms are exactly those. They're just cultural norms. There's no reason why we can't change them, amend them, or, sort of just let go of them altogether.
That is so true, Sama. And maybe also to just understand your divorce coaching work a little bit more, because, there are different things you mentioned that you wanted to be the backbone for some of these women, and especially in the South Asian context. How is your clientele looking like? And at what stage do they come to you? Is it just women? Is it also men? Is it couples? Do they sometimes come to you before they've even had a conversation with their families as a form of counseling or something? How does that work?
It varies. A lot of my clients come through word of mouth and they come at different stages. I think what I find a lot of clients come to me is they are thinking about divorce or have been thinking about divorce for many, many years. They know they're not happy. And I think they come to me in the hope that I'm going to say, yes, I think you should file for divorce. And that doesn't happen, right? Because it's not my job. No matter what personal circumstances a person is in, it's not my job to say, I think you should file for divorce. But what I am able to do is to get people to clear through all of the baggage that's going on up here, that's stopping them from making a decision. Because even if you choose to stay in a bad marriage, which sometimes clients do for various reasons, there are still things they can do to try and improve their status quo. If we choose to stay stuck in one place, that's also a choice that we make. Clients may come before they file for divorce. Some clients come to me, they've already filed for divorce and they're finding the whole process very difficult. So they need a place to bounce ideas. They need a place to sort of offload, vent, a space that is non-judgmental. I have to say 99% of my clients are women. A very few men reach out. I don't know whether it's because they would rather speak to a male therapist. So they come at different stages, but I think largely the common theme is that they're confused as to what they should do. And the reason they're confused is because there's just so much going on. What these kind of sessions allow them to do is to focus, when we're in that place, there's 101 different problems. And what we're trying to do is firefight this and then firefight that. But actually what you need to do sometimes is to just write down everything that is going wrong and start tackling one at a time. We can't fix everything in one go. So when we start clearing all of the noise of daily life and the kids and the job and all of that stuff that we're trying to keep going while everything else is falling apart internally, is to be able to just have that 1 hour or hour and a half to just focus on what is it that I'm actually trying to achieve here? What do you want to achieve? And I think when you start looking at it from that perspective, the whole premise of coaching is that we actually know the answers within ourselves. We just haven't been able to peel away enough layers to come to that answer. So, very often it's just about getting people to think differently, or we might question them. And when I often say to clients, okay, I want you to go away and write me a list of the reasons that you should stay in this marriage. And I said, but you're not allowed to say, well, I'm going to stay because of the kids. I'm going to stay because I can't afford to leave. I'm going to stay because all of these like restrictions that we might have. So I said, I want your personal reasons. What are your needs in this marriage? And how many of those are being fulfilled? Because we can all say that we're staying for the kids. We would all love to do that. But that's not a valid enough reason to stay in a bad marriage, because children can thrive. And in fact, if you're living in a bad marriage, your children are not thriving. You may like to think they are. They're not. Children can see, feel, sense what's going on. And then when you find that you leave that situation, because I think what people fail to sometimes see is that you can still be mum and dad, even if you're not husband and wife. There is no reason why you cannot still be a good mom and you cannot be a good dad just because you're not married to the person that you had the children with. They're completely two different situations and two different sets of relationships. No one client is the same. And sometimes I suppose I am sitting there thinking, please don't go back. Please don't go back. In my head, I'm thinking that. But it's not for me to veer the client in any, they have to come to their own conclusions. I had one client in the US who came to me, was in an incredibly physically abusive relationship. By the end of our sessions, she decided she was going to go back. And I remember thinking, this is not going to end well. But I can't say that. If a client makes a decision that they wish to go back, it's their decision. And about 2 years later, she came back to resume coaching. And at that point had filed for divorce. So the timeline was so personal. At that point, she wasn't ready to leave, even though she knew that it was probably the best thing for her to leave at that time, but she wasn't ready. And then 2 years later, she found she was in a position to be ready. So my job is to just support and walk with people and give them the tools to kind of find their way.
I think that time when you are in the decision-making mode, because sometimes it could be that some big incident is the reason where you're like, that's it. You've reached your limit. Or in other ways, it's the small things that have been accumulating. And having been through that, I remember being in a fog myself. By the time I did take a decision, it was very clear. And had I not done that, and I remember my family who had very little idea of what was going on, but they really wanted me to take this call for me. And I'm glad they did let me, because in the end, had I felt even a slightest of doubt at that time, maybe later in life, I could have had doubts of my decision. So it's really important that the person does it for themselves, because also the healing journey then,
Yeah.
you own it for yourself.
Absolutely. And that's so important. And that's why I often say to clients that your relationship is so different to any other relationship that, like, when people give advice, your friends, your family, they all mean well, but their advice is based on what they've seen throughout their lives. Somebody else is divorced, their sister got divorced, but the dynamics between you and that person, nobody can get an insight into that. Yes, I can sit here and tell you, but the tiny, tiny things that happen between those two people behind closed doors, we're not actually able to articulate those feelings, those emotions. So sometimes when somebody is staying, it's not because, not sometimes, all the time, it's not because they're stupid or they're weak. It's because they're trying to achieve something. Everybody has a point in their life where they will choose themselves. But until they don't reach that point, the best thing that you can do as a friend or a family member or a colleague is to just listen to them, hear them out. Don't judge them. don't give them advice, because actually they know all this, right? They know all of the advice. They've heard it. And the more advice you get, the more confused you are. But actually, the best way to support somebody that's going through this confusion is to just walk with them. Let them offload, let them talk, because often when we are talking, what we're trying to do is make sense of what's going on in our head. So my sister once said to me, she was giving me advice about, you should have said this and you should have said that. And a lot of that stuff was not possible for me because I wasn't that kind of personality. So yes, of course I could have, but it didn't come naturally to me. And I remember saying to her once, "Do you know what? I just wished for once you would just listen to me rather than tell me what I need to do." And bless her, from that day onwards, that's exactly what she did. So she would just allow me to vent and cry and be frustrated and tell her how awful things were between us. Because I said to her, I said, you don't know the solutions because you're not married to him. You don't know the solutions because you don't have two children with this man. There's so many facts that sort of go into that decision. But a lot of the time when you're saying all of these things, you don't want someone to solve it for you because they can't. You just want someone to listen. And as friends and as family, when we care about somebody, our instinct is to try and fix it for them.
Exactly.
But that's not always helpful.
And I can only imagine, Salma, that one of the reasons probably that you are an excellent coach for your clients is because a lot of this is also enriched by your own experience and learnings, and you've really walked the path for yourself. And, based on your experience and based on what you've learned and seen as a coach, what do you now know that you wish you knew then? Whether before you were married, during the marriage, what would you have liked to do differently? Or what would you also advise other women to do differently?
Find your voice. I wish that I had back then not been scared of voicing my needs. I think as women, not only in the Asian community, it's almost like women's needs come last. You look after your husband, you look after your kids, you look after your parents. And if there's any time left, you look after yourself. And so I think if I was to do things differently, I would have given myself a little bit more self-care and self-love, given myself a bit more of a priority up the list of responsibilities that we have as human beings, to be able to have a voice and not undermine myself. And I think that's really important because we leave such little time for our own self-care. Everybody's needs come before ours. But actually, then we find ourselves in a position where we're just exhausted. Mentally, physically, emotionally, we're exhausted. And I think to have some sort of emotional balance in our lives, we need to be able to put ourselves first sometimes. And I think it is really about emotional regulation. We go to see a therapist once we've hit the ground because we want the therapist to help pick us up. But actually, we should be caring about our mental health, about our physical health, emotional health, well before things go horribly wrong. Emotional regulation is something that we don't teach at schools. We kind of learn emotional regulation once we need to. How do we handle stress? How do we handle difficult situations? We learn about how do you have difficult conversations when you get to work, when you get into a corporate environment. But we have difficult conversations in every aspect of our lives. But nobody teaches us how to handle those conversations. Nobody teaches us how to make ourselves heard. In fact, women are often taught the opposite. So I think for me, the most important factor for me is I wish I had a voice and not tried to shut that down.
That's very beautifully put, Salma. And I think that gives it a very apt closing to our set of questions. Finding your voice and finding your own is maybe a joint endeavor for all of us here, you with your work and us with our podcast. It has been really, really lovely talking to you, and we've learned so much, and I'm sure so will our audience. But before we end, is there anything you want to say that we haven't asked you and that's on your mind that you would like to share?
No, I think it's been lovely talking to you. I'm really honored to have this opportunity. I think the only thing that I like to say to all of your listeners out there is actually we really have to believe in ourselves. And sometimes that belief can really challenge us because we don't always know. I just find that as women, we can label each other so easily. We're not just being labeled by the rest of the world. Sometimes we're being labeled by our fellow women. And I think if we can create a world where we are supporting each other as women, rather than label each other or judge each other, bringing ourselves forward, just be there for each other. That's what I think is so important.
I think being in a community or sisterhood of like-minded women can be a really good source of strength because all of us are grappling with
Yeah.
and hopefully also within our community, but also outside. I think now working on this podcast, we realize that even though we think maybe our issues are South Asian specific, and yes, maybe culturally to be understood, it makes sense. But there are so many other issues that are just present for all women everywhere in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so important for us to move together rather than like sort of bring each other down.
Then, on that lovely note, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Salma, for joining us. It has been lovely talking to you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. If you valued this conversation, please share the podcast, rate it, and subscribe to Sunoh wherever you get your podcast from so that you get notifications with each new episode. It helps more people to find us and join this community. You can also find all the details about the guest in the show notes as well as on our social media pages. Please note that this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not replace legal, therapeutic, or other professional guidance that you or someone close to you may need catering to their specific situation. If you are in a dangerous situation, please contact the nearest hotline or authorities where you can find the help you need. Since our podcast caters to global audience, we are unable to share a lot of country-wide resources. But I'm sure your country, your state, your city, wherever you're listening from, has some resources available for you. To share your story or feedback, please reach out to us. Thank you for listening.